Sorry, I'm trying to get
here. I know.
Okay, we are now broadcasting to everybody.
Cool.
We are now live on Facebook and everyone is starting to come in. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Kaylee Wilson, the event director for Midtown Reader, an independent bookstore in Tallahassee, Florida. We are so glad to be hosting Robert Olen Butler today as we celebrate his newest release, Late City. He is joined tonight by Spencer Wise. We are so grateful for the turnout for tonight and thank everyone who adapted to the virtual setting. And we hope you guys are all staying safe during this time. Before I introduce our guests any further, please note that we will allow some time at the end of the discussion for questions from the audience. You can submit a question for Robert at any time during the event using the QA feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will review it at the end. If you'd like to purchase the book, you can order online at midtownreader.com over the phone or by stopping by our store in person, where you will find signed and personalized copies. Keep in mind, we are the only store for Robert's newest release that will have the personalized copies, and those will be available next Monday. We offer contactless pickup and delivery anywhere in Tallahassee for just $5 and are also happy to ship the books worldwide. I'll be dropping the link for that in the chat for both Robert and Spencer's book. And if you have any questions, you can send me an email at kaylee@midtownreader.com. With that being said, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's guests. So we have Robert Olen Butler, who is the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of 18 previous novels, including Hell, A Small Hotel, and Perfume River. He is also the author of 6 short story collections and a book on the creative process, From Where You Dream. He has twice won a National Magazine Award in fiction and received the 2013 F. Scott Fitzgerald Award for Outstanding Achievement in American Literature. He currently teaches creative writing at Florida State University. With Robert, we have Spencer Wise. Spencer is a proud graduate of FSU's Creative Writing PhD program, where he had the pleasure of studying under Bob Butler. His debut novel, The Emperor of Shoes, about an American expatriate running a shoe factory in China, came out in 2018. He currently teaches creative writing at Augusta University in Augusta, Georgia, and frequently talks to Bob about football and writing. They are here tonight to discuss Robert's newest release, Late City, a visionary and poignant novel centered around former newspaper Sam Cunningham as he prepares to die. Late City covers much of the early 20th century, unfurling as a conversation between the dying man and a surprising God. As the two review Sam's lives from his childhood in the American South and his time in the French trenches during World War I as a sniper to his fledgling newspaper career in Chicago in the Roaring '20s and the decades that followed, snippets of history are brought sharply into focus. I will now hand it over to Robert and Spencer, and thank you guys so much for being here tonight.
All right, Bob, I'm going to take over here.
All right.
Are you ready for that? All right.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I'm absolutely honored, and it's a privilege to be able to be here with my dear friend Bob for his new incredible novel, Late City. So excited about this. Bob, when we first talked about it, Bob had mentioned to me that he might not do a reading because he couldn't find one that did it justice. And there are many that do it justice. He might have just been humble about that. So I have made a private request, a personal request, for a specific reading. And this one happens, I don't know how far into the book we are here, but this is a father and son moment. And I just wanted to briefly introduce you to it. The father is Sam, and his son, Brian, are on the L in Chicago, headed for their first father-son sledding trip. And it's a brilliant, wonderful scene full of heart and all the wonderful elements I love about this book. So I thought this would be a perfect point for you guys to take a peek at what he's got here. So Ryan's the son, Sam's the dad, and we get a brief moment in there referencing Sam being in World War I as a sniper. So that's just briefly grazed on, and I think that's about all the readers need to know to be able to listen, and maybe they'll even read along with you, Bob.
Yeah, it's fairly deep in the book, and don't be surprised at a brief early reference to Al Capone of all people. All right, here we go. Ryan, now my son, sitting beside me on an elevated train, the Northwestern line, though I can't see him yet, not clearly. Instead, I feel the abrupt collision of Al Capone and my son, a realization that holds me back, the abruptness, I assume, a product of my dying brain. My son and I are sitting on a green plush transverse seat of the latest model of elevated rolling stock. I'm explaining the new train car to him. I know that much about this moment, though on my deathbed, I can't yet hear my voice. My brain is lagging, perhaps from my news reporter's proclivity for chronology. But no, I realize it's a proclivity that might still be at work. The Capone massacre in the parking garage was on a Thursday. This is 2 days later, Saturday, and I have the day off. My own contribution to yesterday's front page was at the top of column 1, but beneath the full page banner headline about the massacre, whose story dropped into column 8. Mine is Thompson declared unfit for office. Voters League calls for removal. Not totally unrelated to the banner headline, as Mayor Big Bill Thompson, back in office for a third term after a 4-year hiatus of diversified pocket lining on the Waterways Commission, has long worked closely with Torrio and Al and their boys. And abruptly, I am afraid. Recognizing how my thoughts have just wandered from my son to a long since meaningless news story I published 9 decades ago, even to the detail of its very headline. I am afraid that this present haziness about the L train rushing northward and my son sitting beside me, that this very haziness suggests why chronology persists in my dying brain. I neglected him, and time has rolled on with no way to make it up. I spent too much of his first years on earth apart from him, in my work, in my preoccupations, in my focused attention, even as he passed from an infant floating in my hands to a smart, articulate, rapidly growing boy sitting beside me on a Saturday morning nearly 6 years later. I loved him all along. Through that whole passage, I truly did. And I know I told him so, overtly, now and then at least, as I had never heard from my own father nor felt. And I spent what time I could with my son. I sense all this from the cold and freshly besnowed Saturday morning that my memory has chosen for me, even if I'm presently prevented from remembering any specifics backward or forward from it. But I don't do enough for my son. I realize that. I never did, even on this elevated ride. I wasn't present enough with him. Surely that's what God wants me to understand. A testament to my neglect sits sideways in the aisle, propped vertically against me, my arm around it to keep it steady. Weeks ago, Ryan woke to Christmas morning and to the object I am presently clutching upright, a flying arrow sled with a horizontal backless seat of hardwood slats, varnished red and blue, and its name writ large in the center, and with runners made of tempered spring steel, fully controlled by a steering arm slat across the front. This swell sled has sat propped against the wall of Ryan's room for this past month and a half, during which Chicago has been filled every day with snow. And I've had several of those days off. And we are in a computer glitch here. Here we go, got it. I've had several of those days off, and it did not previously occur to me to instigate this outing. The sled was given on Christmas morning with a promise that he and I would learn to use this wonderful thing together, seeing as his Louisianan dad never had one. And Ryan has been a good boy, a very good and courteously indulgent boy, not to push me about that promise. He waited for his dad to feel on his own that the time was right. Though my son's courteous indulgence shames me now, which dispels the haze. And I turn my face to Ryan. He is watching the flash of second floor windows at the back of the brick 3 flats, our elevated track nearer a flat's window than its own front door. Most are curtained, some are not, and when a figure is visible, Ryan lurches ever so slightly toward it and flips his face ever so slightly to follow its passing. One window frames a boy pressed there watching the train, and Ryan sees him and starts to lift his hand, but the gesture it wishes to make is stymied by the quick vanishing of the boy. Ryan turns away. He realizes I'm watching and he looks up at me. Were you going to wave at him? I ask. Yes. He was gone so fast, I say. No, Ryan says, I was gone too fast. I laugh. He's right, of course. My smart little man. I have never talked baby talk to him. Colleen has picked that up too. Tender talk, but not baby talk. I say, that happens sometimes with people. Ryan nods gravely, looks away outside, but I sense him thinking. The mood is catching. I am surprised to find the black boy from Lake Providence come to mind, Cyrus Dobbs, and his voice, not rightly our name, seems to me. I turn my head to look at him, and he is striding away on the crest of the levee. My head clears. My son still sits with his thoughts. What are you thinking? I ask. I'm glad we've got all day, Ryan says. Me too, I say. That boy doesn't care, he says. He just watches everybody rush by. He doesn't expect to make a friend. And Ryan rolls his shoulders a little, shrugs off this topic. I can't wait to go sledding, to get there, I say. He nods at this and looks away again. He squares around and presses close to the window to watch some more. I find myself briefly, faintly surprised. In spite of seeing my little man in my little boy, I expected the prospect of sledding to make him bubble. I now hear his invocation of the long day ahead as a subtle rebuke for the long delay. But I let it rest. He wants to watch the passing city, and I turn to the sled leaning against me. I never had one as a boy, snow being unknown in Lake Providence, Louisiana. But I've done my repertorial research on all of this. He and I will learn together. So we ride to the end of the Northwestern line, passing from Chicago through Evanston until our train finally descends from its elevation into the Linden Avenue terminal in Wilmette. I've learned of a place with good sledding in otherwise flat Chicago and its flat environs. Ryan and I walk north and then east and across Sheridan Road and into a woods where slopes lined in ash and maple run down toward the lake. There are other boys and sleds busy at their sport, but there are several slopes. And I find one for us that's lightly populated. It's a gentler slope with a dog leg and with a leveled foot in plain sight, perfect for a couple of beginners. Ryan is quiet still, focused and studious, but perhaps darker than that, perhaps even fearful. I need to adjust my plan. I thought we'd go straight to belly flops. We'd laugh at our failures. He would bubble. This isn't happening. So we discussed the sled for a time, its relevant parts, discuss and examine it closely. We prepare for this the way a smart and articulate 5-year-old has decided things should go. And he participates fully in the discussion, though thoughtfully, observing how the runners have grooves like skates and admiring the arrow shot through the flying arrow name emblazoned on the center slat. How clever a design that is. I talk sliding strategies with him, discounting the belly flop, with the sled held vertically before you and a running, diving start. A more moderate approach would be perfectly fine, with a few pushing steps while bent forward into a grasp of the sled on the ground and a belly first easing onto the seat. He nods an understanding of this. Then we have talked as much as we can talk. It's time to actually sled. But though he has participated in our discussion with the precocity I admire in him, and which I know he enjoys in himself, his somber mood persists, a little man mood. But I have expected my little boy to appear, bubbling at last about this adventure, and I suddenly worry about all of the time I've spent away from him. He's had a full-time mother, far less of a father, less no doubt than most other boys, even those who have hardworking fathers. The jobs of those men can be left easily behind in the office or in the factory. My job is to observe life, everything about life that is striking or dangerous or influential, and to give it daily voice to 400,000 Chicagoans. I have trouble turning that off when I arrive in the life of my child. In my head, at least, there is no end to my workday. So now I see a problem in Ryan's life. I blame myself. I helped create it. A problem for being a 5-year-old little man is you can miss the risk-taking of childhood. You missed a chance to teach your body and mind to be brave, to fool itself forever into thinking there's no price to be paid in order to be fully a man. Are you all right? I ask him. Yes, he says, unquaveringly, but he says no more. I've never done this before either, I say, because of Louisiana. Yes, so this is a new thing. The world is full of new things. I hesitate, but I add gently, be brave now. You're a brave boy. I know who you are. He looks at me. He looks at the sled, which I have placed between us. He looks down the slope. Shall I go first, I say. Yes, he says. I'll test our plans. Be brave, he says, and he shoots me a sly smile. I'm glad to see the soberness dispelled. I will, I say. You're a brave papa, he says. I am, I say. And he steps back, and I bend to the sled from behind and grasp it and push it along into the slope in an awkward little crouching rush. And I flop forward onto the seat, my torso fitting okay, with my legs bent straight up at the knee. And I'm gliding along head first, going faster than I'd expected and gaining speed. And I grasp the handles of the steering slat for stability, but it's too much of a temptation to try to feel I'm in control. And I try to steer, which of course I overdo badly, and I veer and tilt, and now my man size on this boy sled prevails. And I find myself on my side in the snow and then on my back. I jump up, forcing a laugh, even as I'm rising, to reassure Ryan. I realize I'm a little disappointed that I feel the need to do this. I look up the slope. I don't see him. I pick up the sled, climb the slope, not worried, but puzzled. And there he is, lying on his back, his arms and legs extended, and I am oddly relieved. He's making fun of his old man. Good. That's a spirit he can grow up on. He's even moving his arms and legs in an arc in the snow as if I were thrashing after my fall, in slow motion yet. I laugh an unforced laugh, but I'm wrong. Now that I've seen his little parody, now that I've laughed in appreciation, he should be looking at me, sharing my pleasure at this joke, but he continues the slow thrash and ignores my presence. I do not know what to say to my son. I stand in silence. Then he stops his arms and legs. Now he looks at me. Papa, he says, wait and see. And with meticulous movement of legs and torso and placement of feet and hands, Ryan slowly rises and rotates to the side and lifts one leg and takes as long a stride as he can, and then quickly another, as if not to disturb something. Now he briskly comes to me and turns to stand at my side. He directs my attention to where he was lying. I see for the first time what is there: an imprinted outline in the snow, the imprint of his stocking-capped head and the length of his body. But instead of extended arms, the image is of extended wings. Instead of legs, the image is what I can only be described as a gown. All this I perceive, but I'm struggling to put these elements together. It's an angel, Ryan says. And so it is. I wish to find words, instructive words somehow, corrective words, failing those for the time being, perhaps even carefully circumscribed, approving words, fatherly, loving words. But in spite of words being my profession, even my life now, I have none for my son at this moment. He's bubbling beside me. Isn't she beautiful, he says. I do put my hand gently on his shoulder, a gesture he might well take as approval, but I am unsettled. And Ryan rushes forward, lies down beside his angel in the snow, and he begins to make another. The particularity of the scene begins to fade now. But I am aware that I will go on to teach myself to sled on this day, as Ryan creates a choir of angels in the snow out of what I consider pitying consideration for his papa's enthusiasm. Ryan joins me once to ride on my back after I've mastered the sledding. But in that single run down the slope, I sense his deep unease, and I press him no further. He returns to the snow to play on his own terms until we're on the elevated. Ryan presses against the window on the trip home. He has led us to sit on the left-hand side of the car, viewing the same three flats that he watched coming out. It occurs to me that he's looking to see if the boy at the window will be there. But as I sit beside him, I vanish from the train. I am in France. I am barely 17 years old. I am still a boy, and I am a killer. I see my weapon in my hands, my Pennsylvania Enfield, and I lean into a broken wall, chest high, and across a rubbled field before me is a road, and beyond is a tree line of oak and beech. The Bois le Pretre, the priest's wood. The September offensive has not yet begun. I am forward on reconnaissance, but also to watch for a target of opportunity. A passing German staff car is the prize, or a German sniper coming forward to us. And he emerges from the trees. I put my eye to the scope and my forefinger to the trigger. I see him clearly, but what I fully see lags a fraction of a second behind what I see that only fits my expectation. At first, a German soldier, armed, alone, emerging cautiously from the trees, square before me, and as I see him through the veil of my expectations, professionally alert enough to spot my flimsy cover and to evade me, or to crouch and use the skills he and I share to pose a threat. And thus He must be taken for a worthy and immediate target. I see his forehead clearly in my scope, and my crosshairs are upon it. So the process begins. The tip of my forefinger lying soft upon the trigger, my knuckle aiming, my breath calmly suspended. But in the next fraction of a second, just before the squeeze, I see him fully, and I know he is not a fellow sniper. His rifle is slung on his shoulder. His emerging step is not cautious, but fearful. His assessing first look is unsystematic, inept, and his face is the face of a boy, perhaps 17, perhaps a prematurely thoughtful boy, perhaps a boy who's had a neglectful father, a boy who is ill prepared for what the world is. And all of this next fraction insight rushes into me, even as my forefinger, trained effectively for this world as it is, does its work, and the spot on the boy's forehead between his eyes explodes. I am beside my son and panting hard. I can hear myself clearly, my desperate, labored breath. I look to Ryan. He is unmoved, watching the distant three flats rush past, his limbs comfortably weary from making angels in the snow. And I am afraid. I am in the dark again.
Yes.
Sorry.
Thank you. That was amazing. Oh, I was tearing up.
Me too.
I was totally tearing up. I also have
that's how I know when I'm working at my craft and my art, you know, in a number of places. I measure it's not by checking the grammar and checking the metaphors, it's by this. It's the test of what's in your eye, you know. Sure.
Yeah. I remember Bob reading me a couple passages from the book when you were writing it, and you teared up when you were reading them to me then. And man, yeah, it's beautiful. I also have a 7-week-old son, so it was really getting to me. It's beautiful. Yeah, I mean,
I know what an astonishingly great parent you're going to be. Yeah, you're killing that. You're killing the metaphorically. You're a killer, great novelist instead of a sniper, man. So.
Well, I just wanted the folks who are tuning in to have the pleasure of hearing you read. I miss being able to hear that myself, and in person, like this kind of felt like, and it just gives them a great taste for the book, the complexity. And although we go through the entire century with Sam, really what's amazing about the book are these familial relationships that are so complex and nuanced, and it's all nailed right in here with a father expecting his son to sled a certain way, and the son's own personality emerges, and it's not quite what the father wanted. And so the twists within there emotionally are so perceptive and vulnerable and beautiful that I really love that. And that exemplifies a lot of what I love about your writing. So I think that's a good taste for sort of where the novel, where some of the real heart of the novel is. And there's a lot of heart to it, which is beautiful, despite a lot of fun, meeting all these like great historical figures like Al Capone and moving through the century. So it's got this great balance. So I guess one thing I wanted to ask you, moving on to our little questions session here, I've never gotten to ask you this question. I've asked Bob a lot of questions and about writing, and one of the questions I've never asked is Bob has a ton of newspaper men as his protagonist. I don't know. And I'm thinking off the top of my head that we've got Sam here and we've got all the Chris Cobb books that you wrote. We're all newspaper men. And we have Hell. Trying to think of other ones off the top of my head. And I bet I can if I really.
I bet you could too.
Yeah. I mean, this is the problems of writing 24 books and the problems that we wish we all had. But there's probably some other newspaper men in there. Where does that come from? What there's clearly something that you love about that.
The problem being the challenge to remember them rather than having written them. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, if you write, if the kinds of books you're given to write are what we call literary fiction, then you don't write from schemes and you don't write from your head and you sure don't write from ideas. You write from the place where you dream, your deepest unconscious, and the content that is there, that has dissolved itself. The things indeed, I cherish the fact that I can't remember things. You know, Graham Greene, the great British novelist, once said that all good novelists have bad memories. He says what you remember comes out as journalism. What you forget goes into the compost of the imagination. And he's referring to that same place. Now, my Pulitzer book is from Vietnam. The Army sent me to language school for a year. I spoke fluent Vietnamese when I got there. I worked much of the time in Saigon and so forth. I wandered the back alleys of Saigon every night. And all of that then came out. Vietnam has also been, you know, a major kind of motif through my books.
Yeah.
But you put your finger on another one because I got home from Vietnam in 1973 and I had, or 72, I had gotten, my training had been as an actor at Northwestern University. And then I decided I'd rather write the words than mouth them. And so I got my master's degree from the University of Iowa in playwriting. And then I got gobbled up in the pre-lottery day draft and I went to Vietnam. And I had that ravishing experience in Vietnam. And so when I got back home, playwriting no longer could engage with whatever was roiling inside me. And I knew I wanted to be a novelist. But you don't make a living being a novelist. And so I went to New York City and walked into I looked in the writer's market book for a job in publishing. And that's mostly, as you know, book publishing. I thought I'd end up at Random House maybe. And you know, there were a couple of intern jobs that I couldn't even begin to support myself in New York, in New York. But then there was Fairchild Publications, and I hardly looked at them. And I got there, it turns out that they published a dozen business news. To their credit, they were newspapers. 12 different business categories. These were weekly newspapers, which were really tough-nosed, hard-nosed, investigative journalism. And it was legit journalism, working sources and private sources throughout the business world. And I don't know how I did it. I'd never written a word of journalism, but somehow I convinced the editor-in-chief of electronic news to give me a job. And you know, and he, in fact, the job, he made me the editor of one of the sections in his newspaper. I don't know, my good bad memory, I can't remember a damn thing about that. I cannot even sum up his face, but I know the fact of it. So that's how I began. And then I worked for almost a decade with about 8 years with, let's see. No, it was a decade. It was more than a decade because that was 1985 when I finally had enough novels published I could get a tenure track teaching job at a university, McNeese State University. But in that more than a decade, I worked for electronic news, and then I befriended the president of Fairchild Publications, and this was during the energy crisis. and they decided that they needed a business newspaper, hard-nosed investigative newspaper for industrial, commercial, and institutional users of energy, because energy was suddenly, it needed to be conserved and managed, and prices were important. So they gave me a desk and a blank check, and they said, create a weekly newspaper for people in all realms of business where their businesses use a lot of energy, and create it. So I did, and I've hired my own staff, and we had a wonderful run with a thing called Energy User News. I'm one of the front page stories in Energy User News was on 60 Minutes during its run. So
Wow.
this is the kind of newspaper we were. But I'm getting around to the answer to your question, which is that more than anything I did in schools, and blessed with that memory, I was, as an investigative reporter for electronic news, as that editor, first of all, in the creation of the paper, went out and interviewed hundreds of the people responsible for conserving and managing energy and companies and so forth. And then I was doing my own sources working. When I create characters in my work, my 18 novels and my 6 books of short stories, and I do a lot of first person writing, but even with an omniscient third person narrator, a great third person narrator has an implicit persona, a personality behind the words chosen and the rhythms of speech and all of that. What I do, the central thing I do when I sit down in front of this computer here, is I inhabit the character. I project myself into the sensibility, the body, the senses, the brain's workings, but not so much for its ideas. Even where it is summarizing things and trying to analyze things, it's always through the filter of its emotions and of how it's perceiving and engaging with the events. And so there's always a subtext that is emotional and sensual, even at that. And of course the voices too. So I was stoking my creative unconscious with all of these human beings that I was in contact with. And as an investigative reporter, your job is to get inside the thing, inside the brain, inside the character on the other end of the phone.
Right.
And to understand his subtext, to understand the things he's not saying to you, and to figure out somebody else who can say what that thing might be, So that's why then it's not surprising that when I consult my creative unconscious to write a novel or a story, or let me put it a better way, when a novel begins to shape itself up in my creative unconscious and consults me, that unconscious has not infrequently chosen someone in the journalism world to put in the center of the book.
I love it. I remember you telling me once that you did the same thing at Northwestern, I think, where you were imitating all the professors' voices.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you were also the valedictorian, so it worked.
Yeah, but that just inhabited. And you know how I was a valedictorian? I never read the books until like the last week before class because of my good bad memory. But what I did, I never missed a lecture.
Right.
I never missed a class. And back then, especially at Northwestern, there were almost every course you take in any discipline, there were almost no objective tests. It was all essay writing.
Right.
And so every course that I was in was an exercise in first person narration. Because what I did was I inhabited the professor and gave him or her their voices back to them on the page. And if they hear themselves talking, they go, hey, you know. So that's how I got to be valedictorian, by inhabiting as a writer would, and doing first person narrative riffs in the voice of
The professor.
professor.
That's amazing. That was the beginning, of a great novelist right there.
I would never
slacker.
guess it was the beginning, but I'm not sure anybody's ever led me to say that in an interview either. I'm not surprised. And by the way, I think Kaylee would want us to get.
I can always have plenty of questions, but I'd like to turn it over to Kaylee, the audience, and take it away. If anybody's
actually out there, I would love to hear from them.
Yeah, so we actually did get a few questions in. So I will go ahead and first, Colleen wanted you to know that your reading was gorgeous and to thank you for that. But
Colleen? Did
yes.
You say Colleen? Great. The principal character in Late City is named Colleen, by the way. So.
So from Jenny, she's asking, since you are, a Pulitzer Prize winner, how do you deal with the pressure from, beginning your next novel, and how do you overcome that?
That's a good question. But I never expected to win it in the first place, and having won it, I sort of forgot about having won it. Did I mention my good bad memory? Have I talked about Granbury yet? Yeah.
Yes.
But no, I mean, it's not literally that, but I have had the capacity. When I sit in front of my computer screen, it's just me and the roiling compost royal, the churning compost of my imagination and and she's right. It is it's not automatically. What I'm saying is an easy thing to do, but I really do think, and I obviously don't forget that I've won that prize and others, but the impact of them, the sense of them being here in the engaged life of this computer every morning, that has faded utterly. And every book is a new, very challenging adventure for me.
Thank you for that. Abby wants to know, what is your writing process like? Do you tend to write in the morning, in the evening, notes, outlines, just kind of random thoughts?
Yeah. Wow. There's a long answer for this, and I would recommend my book, From Where You Dream, which is my book on the process of creative writing. The short answer, the initial aspects of those answers, first thing in the morning, before any other the clutter gets into me, and I will put in what feels like a wearying number of hours. I have, on a given book, I hope to get in. I used to hope to get in 400 words a day. The books I'm writing, I'm feeling are more and more challenging. I've written 3 novels since I turned 70, which is 6 years ago. And an awful lot of writers have sort of just stopped by that age. And these are arguably 3 of my best books. But because I'm 76, and because that compost is just crazy, active now, these books are getting more and more complicated and more difficult to write. So I hope not to even stand up if I've got less than 150 words, but I often do 200 to 300 words a day, polished. So that's that process. The other process, it's a complicated thing, and there's not a simple answer for it. That book, From Where You Dream, will say, but it really has to do with finding the characters to inhabit, and getting deeply in touch with the thing that generates narrative from characters, which is, in literary fiction, all narratives have people in the middle that have goals or objectives. I use a different word for that, yearning, which suggests the deepest level of goal and objective. So I am trying to inhabit the yearning of the character. And I have a kind of, borrow a phrase from the nuclear physicist, I have a kind of unified field theory of yearning, which is that if you dig deep enough in a work of literary fiction, the character yearns for a self, for an identity, for a place in the universe. And that yearning for self, if you go back and think about what I just read, that is the thing that is the deep undercurrent beneath all of that, you know. And so, and that's where my focus has to be in my process.
Thank you. We have a few people that wanted to say just, Liz said hello from MSU.
Really?
And listening while at the LA Public Library. Jan wants you to know that, you know, your segment was so great, and that, you know, thank you, Spencer, for choosing it, and that it made her cry a little bit. She can't comprehend had you gathered all the information. She is assuming that you started with index cards or notes on napkins when you were trying to get it all together.
Yeah, yeah. When that happens, it's a second person interested in note cards and so forth. Yes, I do. Well, here are scene cards. I pulled them right out from under my these are scene cards that that I expect to come into play soon in the novel I'm writing now. And so, yes, I do use 3x5 cards, but there's a process of doing them, and it's because I do not want to suggest that I kind of plot the whole novel out ahead of time. You know, it has to be a loose process. Again, I refer you to that book, but yeah, I do use them. I do, and a lot of the kind of detailed information, the flying arrow, sled, and where the Chicago elevator railroad finally comes, where a slope might be in the Chicago area, and all that, everything, all that kind of nitty-gritty stuff, which is I'm scrupulous about. I would not be writing in novels I'm writing today if I was still doing it the way I did at the beginning of my career, when I wrote them on legal pads on my lap on the Long Island Railroad by hand with a drafting pencil, and anything I needed to know about the world came from back here, these books. And here there are about 2 or 3 of those books back there that I ever pull off the shelf anymore. It's called the internet, folks, and I flourish on the internet for knowing how to find and knowing what kind of detail to go after, and then finding it on the internet.
Thank you. So Brad asked, when you're writing this piece set in a historical period, how important do you think it is to make sure the details of the period are correct or authentic? Like what they might have had to drink or what kind of vessel, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely, totally, utterly crucial. Absolutely crucial. In fact, Spencer is such a great novelist, and he recently read the opening of a book. Why don't you tell this guy, by the way, the rest of you understand, but this is no accident, and I'm not being biased, but Emperor's Shoes is a great novel, and he's working on another great one right now. But he can answer that question he's got a very good concrete example of it.
So I was doing research for the novel that I was writing, and I found it was the first page it was like a best-selling novel. And in it, a German spy, a woman walks into a restaurant and she sees a man, her target, the bad guy, across the restaurant. And he's a larger man. And she says, and this is set in 1920s, around World War I, like Bob's. And or part of Bob's, and she walks in and she sees him and she thinks, geez, he must have diabetes. I wonder if he has diabetes, something like that. And I stopped. It's a bestseller, but I totally stopped and I was like, is that something that someone in 1920 really thinks? Or when did diabetes become part of sort of like our layman consciousness? That seems really a while ago. And so I Googled it. And of course, it's much, much later that people were saying jokes like that or having thoughts like that. And so I remember getting so worked up and upset about it that I called Bob and I was like, what do you think about this diabetes thing? And yeah, and because he is just someone that would absolutely not go for it. There's a number of, I think, sins in that example, but one of them certainly is how anachronistic that is and doesn't hold up in the exact way that the person who's asking the question is wondering about. Yeah. And so I'm immediately like out of that, I guess, narrative dream, right away when I read that. And that bothered me. So I don't know, Bob will have more to say about it probably.
And yeah, absolutely. That's good.
This is for you, Spencer. So what was it like to be Bob's student?
Who asked this? Sally.
Yes, Sally. Go ahead, tell the truth.
It was great. No, it was awesome. I mean, I have been blessed to know Bob really well, and I got to work with him. And I'll tell you, if I needed time travel back before I was close with him and think about being a student, and I was terrified of him. I was really intimidated, and but I loved the challenge of getting to meeting that really high expectation that he sets out for literary fiction, and that was the kind of stuff that I loved. And I came here to work with him. So I knew I wanted to do that, and I ended up being his grad assistant. And so we ended up having a great relationship. But it's tough. I think a lot of people flinch when they hear, oh, their stuff's not completely brilliant, or they can push further. There's some other thing in them that is burning hot and needs to be said, but who wants to go near that thing? And Bob will tell them that sometimes people don't love to hear that, and I can appreciate that, but I felt like he was speaking to some truth that I knew about my own writing, and so for me it was a wonderful encouragement. But beyond that, Bob's extremely encouraging and has been my number one supporter and fan, so I owe him a lot.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question. And this is from Phil. And he said, how do you decide if you tell a story in first person or in third person? Or does the story make that decision for you as it unfolds and takes shape?
Well, the story does make the decision. But the essential element that the story, as the story makes its decision, one of the fundamental component there is, and even here you can do it with first person voices, but more likely you would do it with third. For me, the third person, I don't, if it's going to be only one point of view, if we're only going to be inside one sensibility, then almost inevitably, it would, I think pretty much inevitably in my work, it's a first person narration. But if the larger vision of the human condition, that what is roiling around inside you is going to get at, if that requires in the narrative that is shaping up in you that we have access, that I have access in order to write it, and you as readers need to have access to it in order to fully experience that vision of the human condition. That you have in that if that work then needs us to get into the sensibilities of more than one character and move between them, then it will be a third person narration for me, an omniscient third person narrator, and which is an interesting technical challenge, because when I do that, there's a lot of simultaneous things going on, or or interesting little moments of what can be heard, how something is being heard, and yet how that thing is being intended, which you can know both those things only being in both of those sensibilities, but to be able to be in them in an effective narrative way, and to move into one and then into the other and then back out again in a effective, and then into even the third person narrative, being able to give things that neither can see or experience. That kind of complexity requires the third person, and that's what I use.
Thank you for that. So before we wrap up, Bob or Spencer, do you guys have anything else that you would like to say?
No, except that when Spencer was talking, it occurred to me that, Spence, I was sort of like your Bill Belichick, wasn't I?
Oh yeah, you're definitely with Bill Belichick.
Yeah. You heard
Totally.
the Patriots reference earlier, I think, right?
Yeah.
Did you mention
We did. Yeah, we did a football reference earlier.
Football. We didn't get to it.
Yeah, you were definitely my Bill Belichick. Yeah,
He's from Boston, and whatever the equivalent of of a flu virus is for football fandom, I caught it from him. So I live and die with the Patriots with him.
I've infected him. Love it. Yeah, well, this was great. I heartily encourage everyone to get this book. It's one of Bob's best. It's really awesome and moving, and he nailed it again. So get it, and he'll sign it for you too, which is lovely.
Yeah, and by the way, Kaylee works for one of the finest independent bookstores in the country. This is in our Tallahassee area, and they do a nice mail business.
Yes, buy it from them.
And my signature will be on book plates, and it will be my authentic signature signed at this very desk with the year 2021 on it. So it's a special book plate, and other bookshops. But Midtown Reader, I'll be there next Monday morning or Monday afternoon, and anybody who buys a book that wants it personalized and sent to them, I will do that. So
It's awesome.
Yeah. Thank you. Bob, Spencer, thank you guys so much for coming, enjoying time with us. So we're grateful for your support of Midtown Reader. Once again, Lake City and The Emperor of Shoes is available for purchase online at Midtown Reader, or if you're local, stop by our store. And, as Bob said, we are doing personalizations. We're the only ones that's doing personalization, so we would love to see you guys. Thank you again, and I hope you have a great night.
thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.